Hello, Pfoho friends! Welcome to the third annual Grape Jamboree. I'm Julia Patton, your friendly house fellow, and I'll be guiding you through the entire process with the help of my grape assistants, Resident Dean Minnick Roy and Senior Tutor Kate Leach, who is hiding behind the camera. We're so sorry that we couldn't jam out in person this year, but I hope that you'll have a great time watching the entire process. Let's begin! The first thing you need in order to make grape jam are the grapes. Thankfully, our amazing house faculty deans, Anne Harrington and John Durant, know just the place, their courtyard. Oh, there's Anne now. Hi, Anne. We had determined earlier in the week that the grapes were ready for harvesting. From the ground, they were looking dark purple and ripe. Now that I'm clambering around on this ladder, I bet we could have waited a little longer, because there are still many small green grapes too, but I'm sure we'll have enough. Carefully, we cut the grape bunches and fill our buckets. Now it's time for the separating. Let's move this process over to faculty row, shall we? Minnick and I prepared a large table outside where we dump all of the grapes for sorting. This is where we get ourselves into a sticky situation. Seriously, sticky. We separate the ripe purple grapes from the stems and green grapes. All of the ripe grapes will become our jam. The remainder will go into the compost. A few underripe grapes can come along for the ride too, but not many. Wait! Before continuing with the next step, let's break for a mini lesson explaining the difference between jam and jelly. Both are delicious, sweet and fruity. So what's the difference, you ask? Well, jam is made with the entire fruit, while jelly is made only with fruit juice. I think jam has a better flavor, and despite the insane sugar content, I think jam could be marginally healthier due to the included fiber. The last part is my opinion, not a fact. There are also differences in the ingredients and processing between jam and jelly, but that's for another day. Today, we are making jam. The next step in the process is removing the skins from the grapes. This step is important because the grapes have seeds that need to be removed, but we really want the skins. Without this step, the skins, with all of their flavor and color, would also end up getting strained out with the seeds. Don't worry, you'll see what I mean in a minute. So, off with their skins! Minnick and I begin skinning the grapes, but I soon abandon her in order to run around and set up the supplies needed for the canning process. Off screen, I'm setting up the burners, getting a gigantic pot filled with water, bringing out the food processor, and gathering the rest of the canning supplies. Someday I'm going to remember the more efficient placement for the burners, but that day is not today. You'll probably see them move around several times. I also begin the sterilization process of the jars. This is done by lowering all of the empty jars into that gigantic pot filled with water. The flower on this screen you see at the bottom of the pot are to prevent the jars from touching the heat source directly. Without this step, you run the risk of breaking the jars due to thermal shock. Wait! Before continuing with the next step, let's break for a mini lesson explaining the perils of thermal shock to glass canning jars. We all know how fragile glass is and how easily it can break. Glass also really doesn't like dramatic changes in temperature. While canning, it's very important to make sure that the jars and the contents in the jars are hot before lowering them into a pot of hot or boiling water. It's also important to make sure that the bottoms of the jars never touch the bottom of the pot directly over the heat source. It's really not a great time when you're lowering the jars into the water and they all break due to thermal shock. Once the jars are in the pot, I can now set the burner to high to get the water boiling and the jars sterilized. The jars should boil for 10 minutes. Then I turn the heat to very low to keep everything hot. Great! That's done, and thankfully, so is Minnick. The next step is to put the grape skins in stages in the food processor. We give the skins a whirl, and then put them all in a pot on low heat to begin breaking them down. At the same time, we put the skinned grapes into another big pot. It's too bad it's not closer to Halloween, Kate's favorite holiday, because these grapes look like a big bowl of goblin eyeballs. I put this pot on medium-high and begin to mash them until the grapes break down. Both the skins and the grapes are on the stove for about 10 minutes. From here, I pour the cooked grapes into this strainer and slowly press all of the pulp through while leaving behind the seeds. If we had left the skins on the grapes, this is the part where the skins would also be inadvertently removed. This step has also notoriously been the most difficult part in years past. Well, third year's a charm, because I finally figured out the fastest and easiest way to do this. Sorry to the Pfoho Grape teams of 2018 and 2019 for all the grape lengths that you went through. Now it's time to add all of the grape pulp, grape skins, the juice of 1 lemon, and an unbelievable 10 cups of sugar, it was supposed to be 12, but I couldn't bring myself to do it, in a large pot and set to boil. Once boiling, I lower the heat to simmer and stir, and you get the point. We're really getting in the jam now. This takes a long time, about 45 minutes, because the jam needs to reach the temperature of 220 degrees Fahrenheit. The jam comes to a boil quickly, but getting those extra 8 degrees really takes a while. Once the jam finally reaches 220 degrees Fahrenheit, hooray! It's time to test. Earlier, I placed several spoons and plates in the freezer. In order to test the jam, you take a frozen spoon and a frozen plate and see if the jam turns into a sheet while falling off the spoon. The first attempt didn't seem to work, so I turned the heat back on and held the jam at 220 degrees for a little while longer. The second attempt worked. Congratulations! We've just made jam! If we wanted to put the jam directly into the fridge and eat it soon, we're all done. But I want this jam to be shelf stable so it can be sent to some lucky Pfoho raffle winners. So now it's time to can. I remove the hot jars from the pot of water and begin filling the jars with the jam. The jars need to have a 1/4 inch minimum space at the top, and I also need to try to avoid getting any jam on the top rims of the jars. Once all the jars are filled, it's important to take a wood skewer, not metal, pesky thermal shock again, and circle the outside of the jars to release any trapped air bubbles. Air bubbles can interfere with the canning process. Next, I need to wipe the rims with a damp cloth to remove any jam that might have gotten there. This can also interfere with the canning process. Then, I place the lids on top and tighten the bands until I just feel resistance, but not much tighter. From here, I lower the jars into the pot of hot water. I have worked quickly enough so that the jars are still very hot. Once the jars are in the pot, I set the burner again to the highest setting and wait for the water to come to a boil. I always forget that this also takes some time. Once the pot is boiling, I continue to boil the jars for 10 minutes. After 10 minutes, I turn off the heat and allow the jars to sit in the hot water for another 5 minutes before removing the jars to the cutting board to cool. This resting step in the hot water is important because of, you guessed it, thermal shock. I know that I've done the process correctly because after the jars are removed from the pot, we begin to hear the of the lid sealing, which is such a cool sound. That's it, now we're done. I missed you all so much this canning season. It was so much work without all of your help. I hope that we can come together next year for this fun event again. A special thanks to all of the members of the Pfoho community who helped make this process possible, and an extra special thanks to senior tutor Kate Leach for her directing and handy camera work.